right, we are right at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover today, and we're all very excited to share some of these preliminary results with you. But firstly, I just want to welcome everyone to the webinar and thank you all very much for being here with us today. My name is Kayla Ripple, and I'm a senior associate with the LenFest Ocean Program. So if you haven't heard of us, the LenFest Ocean Program is a grant-making program. We fund ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups that address scientific needs facing managers and decision makers today. So you can learn more about us at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter to receive updates on all the projects we support. If you're on social media, I'd also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter at LenFest Ocean. In fact, we'll be live tweeting this event today, so if you'd like to, you can follow along there or interact with us using the hashtag LOPwebinar. And before we get started, I just want to share a few webinar logistics with everyone. Firstly, all attendees are muted to prevent any feedback or echoes during the webinar. But we do want to hear from you, and we're saving time at the end for some questions and answer. To submit a question, you can type it into the Q&A panel at any point during the webinar, and I'll be keeping track of those, and at the end, we'll read them aloud for panelists to answer. You can also interact with the speakers and each other in the chat box. Please feel free to share any resources or links you think would be helpful for us to be aware of. My colleague Emily Knight will also be sharing links to project-related materials in the chat, so keep an eye out for those. But please do make sure that your questions are in the Q&A box. It might get lost in the chat, and it might be harder for me to keep track of it. I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions, and if you put it in the chat box, I might accidentally lose track of it. Additionally, closed captioning is enabled for this webinar. So if you'd like to turn captions on, you can click the CC button on your Zoom toolbar. Alternatively, if you'd like to turn them off, just click the button again and they should disappear. And lastly, this event is being recorded, and once it's available, I'll distribute a link to the recording along with links to all the materials that were shared in the chat. And now to get to the fun part, today we're very excited to have joining us Doctors J.J. Cruz-Mota with the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, Stacy Williams with the Institute for Socio-Ecological Research, and Tarsila Sierra with New Haven University. This project picks up where another project we supported, the LenFest Fishery Ecosystem Task Force, dropped off. In collaboration with the Caribbean Fishery Management Council and numerous other individuals and organizations, JJ, Stacy, and Tarsila have been working to gather stakeholder input that will inform a fishery ecosystem plan in the US Caribbean. Now, I should mention that this work has yet to be finished. The presentation you see here today includes only early results, but the research team and LenFest feel it's really important to keep everyone informed throughout the project duration. So that's why we wanted to share what they've learned so far with you today. If you do have questions or comments or thoughts, please do reach out to us with any questions, or you can reach out to any of the research team members and speakers today. So before I turn it over to JJ to get started with the presentation, I just want to share a quick 5-minute video that summarizes the outcomes of the Fishery Ecosystem Task Force I mentioned earlier. And hopefully this provides a bit more of background context for where this project picks up. So let me share that.
We used to think about the oceans as boundless, capable of producing limitless amounts of food and resources. But today we understand that that's not the case. All species in the ocean are interconnected. What we do to one species impacts other areas. The LenFest Ocean Program is a science grant-making program based at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Its mission is to work alongside scientists and managers to identify the most pressing questions facing the coastal and marine environment, and to fund scientific research projects to fill those information gaps. We tackle fisheries issues around the world on how to create sustainable catches. We are looking at how climate is impacting species movements in the United States and also around the world, and what impact that might have on coastal communities.
I first learned about the Lenfest Ocean Program when they reached out to ask if I would have interest in pursuing a particular research project that they had prioritized. Our charge was to try to provide really practical, tangible advice of how to implement what we call fishery ecosystem plans, which we saw as a critical tool in order to do this thing that we call ecosystem-based fisheries management. The fundamental goal of ecosystem-based fisheries management is to think about the broad collection of goods and services that ecosystems provide, how we can continue to get those services while preserving them for future generations.
Sharing research results and engaging with stakeholders is what sets the Lenfest Ocean Program apart. During one of those conversations, we learned of a need on the ground in the Caribbean where those research results could be used.
My name is Graciela Garcia Moliner. I worked at the Caribbean Fishery Management Council. Our latest endeavor is to actually prepare a fishery ecosystem plan. One of the things that's really important for this area is that we are all surrounded by water anywhere you look. We have a very high diversity of habitats within that very small area. We have an extreme diversity of species, not only those targeted by the fisheries, but also species that are prey to many other species that come by seasonally.
The Caribbean is a very diverse place. Each island is very different in terms of the social context, the ecological context. So they were really realizing they needed to have a place-based management rather than a species-based management. Essentially what our report put forward was a blueprint of how do you navigate that landscape.
Lenfest came at a very good time for the process of implementing ecosystem-based fishery management in the Caribbean. One thing that we're lacking is the actual science-based monitoring of our fisheries. We've been collecting data from the fisheries for over 30 years, and we've been collecting environmental data on and off, or in some cases over that same period of time, but we've never actually put really the two together in terms of managing fisheries. We need to find out what is the balance that needs to be maintained in the marine ecosystem for it to function properly and to maintain the sustainable fisheries for the long term.
Collaboration between scientists, managers, and stakeholders is essential because each party brings a different skill set to the table.
We had a lot of members of the Caribbean Fishery Management Council executive staff, people involved in fisheries, people involved in the management, science. I was just so struck by how much everyone cared. The magic really happens when all those people come together and find solutions collaboratively.
Seeing everyone get so involved and come forth and talk about it and contribute to the development of the models has been an amazing process. That is extremely important because the ecosystem is composed of many phases. And anyone who uses any one of the marine resources will have something to say.
Together, that group of individuals can bring their expertise to best answer the questions facing the marine environment.
Lenfest has provided the opportunity to open up the floor to more stakeholders, all contributing to the same effort to actually produce a fishery ecosystem plan that will provide the decision makers with enough information to then be able to manage it in a sustainable way. And I think that it's going to really be very important for the wider Caribbean.
The Lenfest Ocean Program will continue to build upon these collaborations and support useful and usable science that leads to evidence-based decision-making to support healthy oceans, the planet, and our future.
And with that, I'll turn it over to you, JJ, to get the presentation started.
Good afternoon. Can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you everybody for joining in today, and also for the Lemphis Ocean Program to organize this webinar that give us the opportunity to share with you what we have found so far. Let me start with the definition of EBFM that we're using in this project, which is the one that was implemented by NOAA. And I won't go into the details of that definition because it was very well summarized during the video that we used. So the important thing here is that even though we are using this definition, it's not the only one. And one of the challenges implementing EBFM is that we have still today, different meanings to this, what this means. And actually, there is a nice review put in a book by two researchers of NOAA, in which they state, okay, we're still trying to find out what EBFM means and how we're going to implement this. But one thing that I want to rescue from that review is that all of them agree on the fact that it implies moving beyond a single species approach. And just to summarize this, I just want to show you these schematic representations in which on top you have the single species fisheries management approach, in which one single stock is managed and the source of non-natural mortality is fishing. That management strategy is reflected typically in a fisheries management plan. A further development on that single species approach is that includes other potential drivers of the fisheries of that single stock, in which elements like predation or habitat health structure, biotic conditions, and anthropogenic influences are brought into the model, but still is the management of a single species. We're trying to model one species. And that's also portrayed in a fisheries management plan. What we are trying to achieve is the following. We're trying to understand and ergo manage the full assemblage that is targeted in the region. And for that, not only we consider fishing as the only source of non-mortality, non-natural mortality, sorry, but also, as it was very well explained in the introductory video, we're taking into consideration all these socioeconomic aspects. And of course, we're bringing into the modeling all the drivers or potential drivers of this fishery, not related, directly related to the fishing activity itself. Now, in terms of the Caribbean, this was also very well explained in the video by Graciela, in which the Caribbean is the region, but all regions are unique. But in this case, the Caribbean has those 8 characteristics that has traditionally been put forward as the disadvantages of our region to properly implement a single species management approach, such as stock assessments. I want to highlight here those perceived disadvantages like lowest landings, data poor, and it's only artisanal fisheries, and not many people depend on that fisheries, right? So The question here, why bother, why fund research in this area that seems unimportant? Because there are, and I'm gonna summarize what the video said, there are some characteristics here that perhaps will make this system ideal to implement or to try some of these EBFM ideas. And there you will see what we heard before is highly diverse. In the US is the region with most managed species. 80% of our fishery depends on the habitat on coral reef, and the relationship between the productivity and the area is high. And most importantly, as you will see later on in this presentation, because of the small size, there is a high involvement of stakeholders. People, different stakeholders really care on what is happening about the fishery system and are willing to participate and most importantly share their knowledge. Also, because it's a coastal fisheries, is subject to many other sources of non-natural mortality different to fishing itself. So all these very heterogeneous, very variable world, multi-specific, multi-driver, multi-gear, multi-objectives present, and we're proposing that presents a unique opportunity to test and implement different IBFM approach. Actually, some of us will venture that in this condition will be perhaps the only option. So based on this, within this framework, the aim of our work is to help develop an EFP for the US Caribbean, which then will help managers to implement this EBFM. To do this, we are using a roadmap developed by the LENFES Task Force on EBFM. Is a roadmap that considers 5 steps, out of which currently we are working on step number 1, and these are the results that we're going to present to you today. That first step involves developing a conceptual model, select and estimate indicators, and 3, do an inventory of threats. To address question number 1, we are using 2 approaches. We're using a qualitative approach that is based on stakeholders' perceptions, and we are also using a quantitative approach, which is based on the analysis of existing data. And these 2 approaches have been concomitant, that they have been happening and at the same time, as you will see in the next few slides, and they have been feeding to each other, complementing to each other. Now, to explain each one of these components, I will leave you with Tarsila, which will develop further on the qualitative approach. Thank you very much. Tarsila.
Thank you, JJ. Hello, everybody. As JJ said, I'm going to talk about the methods and the preliminary results that we have to date on the qualitative approach. So JJ, I'm just going to ask you to move to the next slide.
Sure, I will.
Right. So for the qualitative component of the project, the main method that we chose, that we are utilizing, was the development of stakeholder-driven conceptual models. So the objective of creating these conceptual models was so that we could visualize and do some in-depth analysis of stakeholder perceptions. So it was a method to allow us to bring the stakeholder perceptions into the process. With this, we are also able to identify priorities and risk factors, and I will begin to talk about how we are analyzing the data to do that today. That also helps us to identify some important data gaps, so aspects that are important from the perspective of the stakeholders that we perhaps don't have existing data, and that will help us in terms of future priorities for research as well. And the conceptual models are also a very good way to develop some hypotheses that can be tested through the quantitative approach. And that is a very important next step. We're starting that process. Stace is going to talk a little bit about the beginning of that process, but this will be something that will also be an important part of this. Next. So just to give a brief explanation of what I mean by a conceptual model, we use the fuzzy cognitive map approach, and in this case, these were stakeholder driven. So during the process of developing and building the conceptual models, stakeholders would identify important components of the ecosystem that were important for them, high priorities in terms of these components. And in this very simplified example that we have here, the components would be the circles, so coral reefs, fish, pollution, any important components from the perspective of the stakeholder. And then stakeholders would then identify linkages or relationships between these components, and they can be weak, strong, they can be positive and negative. And positive and negative meaning if one increases in quantity or quality, the other also increases, or if one decreases, the other also decreases, or if one increases, the other decreases, that would be a negative relationship. So this is a simplified version of what we actually accomplished with the stakeholders, and I will, yes. So we ran a number of workshops, and I will say that our effort of building conceptual models was not the only effort. There were other efforts that were led by the council. And we worked in collaboration to make sure that our methodology was compatible, because in our analysis, we are using all these conceptual models that were built. And so we listed them here. The council-led conceptual model buildings with the district advisory panels, with the SSE, and there are also efforts led by PU that involved businesses and NGOs in the region. And the numbers here represent the number of conceptual models of workshops that were done, and in parentheses, the number of stakeholders that were engaged during the workshops. So our project, our effort focused on workshops with academia, with managers, and with fishers. So because this was happening during the pandemic, we had to adapt. So some of these workshops were done virtually. Initially, we wanted to do all of them in person. So the academia and the managers workshops were done virtually, but we waited until we could go back into the field to do all the fisher workshops in person. And we did 12 of them in Puerto Rico and the USVI in total, and we involved about 117 fishers. So for the, I think you can go to the next slide, JJ. So during these workshops, we used the same materials to present the information and the objectives of the effort to the stakeholders. We explained what a conceptual model was and how it was developed. And we also used prompt questions that were the exact same during all these workshops. And if you click the next and one more, these are the prompt questions that we use. So we asked stakeholders to identify components first, and then we asked them to identify linkages between and relationships between these components. Next slide. So for all the in-person workshops, we ended up with this something similar to this picture that you can see up at the top. And for the virtual workshops, we worked on the mental model or software. But for all the in-person workshops, we ended up creating an electronic version of the conceptual model. And the importance of this step is so that we could transform all of this information into a matrix. So what you see here is a matrix of all the components. So they are in the columns and the rows, and we can then identify presence or absence of relationships between components. And so with this matrix being set up this way, we could then bring all conceptual models into this one big matrix so that we could look at and analyze the data it gives us the ability to compare the different stakeholders, the different stakeholder groups. So the next slide. One important step in this process was to work with the terminology. So we ended up, of course, with lots of different words that meant the same thing. We had to make decisions, and so this was something that we did very carefully. We spent a lot of time looking at the synonyms and looking at these the terminology, and this is something that we will also, there's in the next step of outreach, there will be some validation of some of the ways that we, particularly ways that we grouped components, but this was something that we took a good amount of time working on. We ended up with a lot of different components that were very similar. So we went through this step, and then the next step, the next slide, was to bring it all together in a matrix that looks like this. It is a very big matrix. There's thousands, if I couldn't fit everything here, but just to give an example of, just so that you can understand the data that we used for the results that I'm going to show next. So this matrix right here, actually, if you go back just 1 second, just so I can explain that. This matrix we're, instead of looking at just components and columns and components and rows and the absence or presence of relationships between the components, what we ended up with was actually relationship by relationship. So each variable in this matrix right here is a relationship between components that could be positive, could be negative or neutral. And each column represents a different conceptual model. And then we have presence or absence of those relationships between different components. So this is the matrix that we use for some of the results that I'm going to show. And for the results using the matrix that I just explained, we did some similarity analysis to look for similarities and differences between stakeholder groups based on relationships that were identified by stakeholders during these conceptual models. And we use MDS, or non-metric multidimensional scaling, to visualize these differences and similarities between stakeholder groups. Another set of analysis that I'm going to show today were done using a two-mode social network analysis. And for those, we're looking at different components. So components that were considered to be drivers affecting other components, and components that were considered receivers that were being affected by other components. And we're looking at differences and similarities between stakeholder groups in terms of components that they identified as being important. So all of these analyses that we're going to share today had the objective of identifying important ecosystem components from the perspective of the stakeholders, as well as relationships between them. And this is the first step in the analysis for identifying important indicators, important risk factors, and also to help us identify some important data gaps. So I'm going to start by showing you some of the results of the similarity analysis. And right now we are looking at the US Caribbean. And not a by-island analysis. We are working on that. That's going to be by the end of the month when we do the presentation for the joint SSE EBFM TAP. We will have the analysis done by island, but for now, I'm presenting the US Caribbean as a whole. So what we're looking at here in this analysis of similarity, and this is essentially the spatial representation of similarities and differences between these stakeholder groups based on their identification of relationships between components. So what we see here is that we have a group where we see DApps and managers grouped up at the top, NGOs and businesses on the other, forming another group over here. And then we have academics right in the middle, and then the fishers right here. Where, so this is just showing, and if we go to the next slide, JJ. So right here, it's in the actual relationships that are driving the spatial patterns that we're seeing here in similarities and differences between stakeholders are included. And because there are many of them and they're stacked on top of each other, it is very difficult to read. But what I wanted to show with this and stress with this particular figure right here is that there are some unique perspectives that are driving this pattern that we're seeing. For instance, right here, when we look at the Fishers group, there are about there are a lot of different relationships that are stacked on top of each other. There's over 300 of them that we're actually, in the next slide, I'm going to show some examples of these. But for the Fishers group, there are a very large number of unique relationships that were identified by this group that are driving the spatial pattern that we're seeing here, of the fishers being down and separated here at the bottom. And it's really interesting as preliminary analysis that these are very unique perspectives that the fishers are bringing to the process. And I think that's a really interesting example of the importance of co-production of knowledge and the importance of involving different stakeholders in the process. And this, for instance, is a set of information, of perspectives that we would likely not capture if we didn't do an approach that was collaborative. And likewise, there are a number of different perspectives that are coming from all the different stakeholders. So I know that this is not easy to read, because all of these relationships are essentially stacked on top of each other. But here, what I did was just I picked the top relationships that were explaining the spatial patterns that we're seeing here. And so for all the ones in black, these are the top with the highest factor scores, relationships explaining the spatial pattern. And for the fishers, because what I explained before, we have over 300 relationships that actually have the same high and the same factor score, I picked some examples. We are right now in the process of working on better ways to visualize this information. As we mentioned a couple of times, these are some of our preliminary results. But one of the interesting things that you can see just by looking at the top relationships that are driving what we're seeing here in this analysis is that there are a lot of commonalities between the components and some relationships, but we see that even when components are repeated, they are essentially either in different relationships with different components. And so that also stresses the different perspectives that each stakeholder group is bringing. Even when talking about similar components, they are coming from different perspectives of the different stakeholders. And that also stresses the importance of bringing in these different perspectives and doing co-production of knowledge and really getting into a way of looking and analyzing these important ecosystem components from these multiple perspectives, something that we perhaps would not be able to do if we weren't bringing these different stakeholders to the table. So the next set of analysis are the two-mode network analysis. And here, instead of looking at relationships between components, so the previous slides, the previous analysis were looking at that matrix that I showed that has presence and absence of relationships between components. Here, we're only looking at the actual components. And so in this first slide right here, we're only looking at components that stakeholders identified as drivers. So anything that was in a conceptual model that was affecting something else is considered a driver, and anything that's being affected by something is considered a receiver. And in the next slide, I'm going to show the same for receivers, but for now, we're only looking at drivers. So this is just all the components that stakeholders identified in the conceptual models. And we have different groups of stakeholders, the 6 groups of stakeholders again, so the DAPs, the fishers, NGOs, businesses, academics, and managers, they are represented by the gray squares. And all the circles represent components that they have identified in the conceptual models as drivers. And the colors represent how many stakeholders groups mention that component. So we're looking at similarities and differences between stakeholders in components that they identified as being important. So also, there's a lot of information on this figure, but what I want to call your attention to is that there are a number of components that are, again, unique to specific stakeholder groups. So if you look at all the pink components here, the pink circles, so for instance, the fishers brought in a number of unique components that only that group brought to the conceptual models, same with the DAPs and same with the other stakeholders, but that really stresses that, again, the importance of bringing in these different perspectives with their unique priorities. And also in this figure, if you look at the middle where the red circles in particular are all components that were mentioned by all 6 stakeholder groups. So these are components that everybody thought were important. So this is what, essentially representing commonality of perspectives between the different stakeholders. And these can be used, and right now are being used in our analysis to identify top priorities, to identify some potential indicators, and starting from where the stakeholders agree. So this, we looked at all the components that are driving relationships. We did the same thing. If you go to the next slide, JJ, we did the same thing for components that were being affected by those drivers. And again, the patterns are similar. You see that there are a number of unique components that were brought in by the different stakeholder groups, and also common components to all 6 stakeholder groups. And in the next slide, we just created a table, and here it's just a way of easily just listing and visualizing all those components that were common to all 6 stakeholder groups. The drivers and receivers are listed separately, but in the shaded top of that table, we see components that were identified as both drivers and receivers by stakeholders, by all 6 groups of stakeholders. And this is just an example of extracting the information of what are common priorities and common components for all 6 stakeholder groups that we worked with. Next slide, JJ. And actually, if you want to go back, because I didn't spend too much time just talking about what they are, but just in case you didn't have enough time to take a look, but some of the top components that we identify are recreational fishing, coral reefs, climate change, runoff, management, tourism, and education and outreach. Those are for both drivers and receivers, but also other components that were significant as drivers for all stakeholders are disturbances, coastal development, marine diseases, sargassum, commercial fisheries, local culture, and religious traditions. And then on the receiver list, we also have water quality, mangroves, and seagrass. So this is the reason why I wanted to spend a little bit more time here too, is because those are going to be important later on when Stacy's talking about the quantitative analysis. So we can go to the next slide too, JJ. So just to summarize some of the highlights from the analysis that we did so far, what's really interesting about this is that, in these analyses and working with the data from the conceptual models, we are really analyzing the entire ecological system. We're not just looking at factors affecting a specific target species. This was a process that had extremely comprehensive stakeholder involvement. So what we're seeing here as products really is a product of collaboration of everybody bringing in their perspectives, so we can see unique perspectives and commonalities in this process. We can consider all of that. And one thing that was unique to the approach that we did too is that we did workshops separately with the different stakeholder groups. And with that, each stakeholder group really had a chance to work on their conceptual model and really in depth with their priorities that were unique to that stakeholder group. And we also avoided some reactivity and some, other potential issues of working with different stakeholders together. As I mentioned before, and this is going to be very important, particularly for the next steps, and we are going to really dive into the patterns of similarities and differences between stakeholders, and we're also going to do the analysis by island. And there are so many different ways that we can analyze, that we can present this information. And so this is really, it's going to be really interesting to, with our next steps to find different ways to present and analyze this data, and to also to particular stakeholders, but also for particular objectives and goals. Now, I think our results so far really emphasize that the importance of co-production of knowledge, of bridging knowledge, of bringing stakeholders into the process. As I highlighted multiple times, there are very unique perspectives that we were able to bring to this that we would not be able to capture if this wasn't a true collaborative approach. And we're also finding that there are some components that are sort of being highlighted as very important for all stakeholder groups. They are not currently being considered. So one of them, for instance, is recreational fisheries. There are lots of really interesting relationships with that component that it will be interesting to look into in more in depth. So we'll now have Stacy continue our presentation, talking about the quantitative approach.
Thank you, Tarsila, and thank you everyone for joining and listening to this presentation. So I'm going to go over a little bit about the approach that we are taking to building these quantitative models. The objective of looking at this data quantitatively is to identify some of these indicators that are driving the temporal and spatial changes in the fisheries ecosystem. With this, we hope that we can identify some of these similarities and gaps among the different data types. And I'll go over a little bit about the data types that we're working with, but some of these are the biological, environmental, socioeconomic, and landing data. We will then test these quantitative models using a structural equation model. And as Tarsila and JJ mentioned, these quantitative models are going to be melded with the qualitative conceptual models. So we're going to see what the similarities are and identify some gaps. As Tarsila mentioned, we, like with looking at the indicators identified in the quantitative models, if that is not being highlighted in the qualitative model and vice versa, then we can further look into possibly adding data collection for that specific factor or variable. So JJ, next. So if you attended our first presentation, these maps are going to be quite similar. So the data that we have been compiling is from different monitoring programs. So the first monitoring program is CMAP-C data. This is a Southeast Area Monitoring and Assessment Program. This is a long-term data set. This is fishery independent data. So at every single white dot, we are able to have, we have fish abundance and fish biomass through hook and line. And at one point, also trap data. Next. The second data set that we are working with is the long-term monitoring programs in Puerto Rico and the USVI. These are at permanent station and in-water surveys. So these sites are surveyed annually or biannually, depending on the program. The data that we have are fish abundance and biomass, and also benthic coverage. Next. Lastly, we have, and we're working with NOAA National Coral Reef Monitoring Program. The different colored dots represent the different times that these sites were surveyed. So this data, the data that we're using is actually between 2013 and to 2017. And again, similar to the local monitoring programs, we're able to analyze fish abundance and biomass and benthic coverage. So next. So as you can see, there's a lot of data that we are working with, but however, I have to mention that there are some data gaps. As you can see in the north coast of Puerto Rico, there's only a few data sites that have been surveyed here. And this is mostly due to the weather conditions in the north coast. It's really difficult to survey these areas, but overall, there is a lot of data to work with. Next. So this is the biological data is just not the entire data set that we are analyzing, as we've been mentioning this entire this entire presentation, is that the fishery ecosystem just does not include biological, but also socioeconomic components and environmental components. So at each one of those biological data sites, we were able to extract satellite-driven data, and this was with the help of Dr. Ileana Cholet. She extracted all these variables. So all the variables that we are able to extract are in the table to the right. The ones highlighted in red with asterisks are in time series. So we're able to look at the variation through time at these specific factors. We also have other data sets, like fishery dependent data sets from landing data from fishers and observers, and also socioeconomic data sets from the census or from NCRIP data. So we're going to be looking at the different relationships between these data sets and see if there's any type of similarities or disparities. Next. So just to show you a quick I guess, snippet of what the results, some of the results are going to look like. So this is looking at the entire fish assemblage, specifically at abundance. And it's comparing the Puerto Rico Coral Reef Monitoring Program, which is at permanent stations, and that for the NCRIP data set in 2016. So the Puerto Rico Coral Reef Monitoring Program had many sites at one point, and now it's 42 sites, but I included all sites for this presentation. So with the MDS, as Tarsila mentioned, it's a really nice visual tool to see which of the sites are similar and where there are some disparities. And with these specific MDSs, I categorize them into regions. So you can see in the PR crimp data that there are some clumps of sites, and these clumps of sites are related to, it looks like, two regions. So you can see to the circle to the left in the PR crimp graph that those sites are around Mona and Desecheo. These are islands off of the west coast of Puerto Rico. Just below that, there are a clump of sites that have similar fish assemblages, and these sites are located in Vieques and Culebra. And then to the right, there are similar fish assemblages, and these sites are in around San Juan area. So you can see that there are some regional differences in fish assemblages in the PR crimp data. Now in the NCRIP data in 2016, you can not see the the separation so clearly, but still there is some clumping. If you click on the JJ, so you'll see that there's some clumping of the blue sites, which are the east sites, and also the red sites, which are the north sites. So those fish assemblages are similar in that region at those sites. So next. So I looked further at this data set to see what environmental variables were driving these patterns in fish assemblages, and this was using a distance-based multivariate multiple regression. And looking at PR crimp data, the more significant drivers of the fish assemblage patterns and PR crimp data were larval connectivity, and there's papers stating that higher abundance of fish are likely to be at sites of sinks. So another factor that is highly related to the fish assemblage is distance from spawning site or spawning aggregation, inorganic pollution, this is runoff to sea, human population density, and max productivity, which is driven by a chlorophyll-based model. Now, looking at the NCRIM data, there's some similarities like larval connectivity, but however, mean rainfall showed up as a factor driving these patterns in fish assemblages in the NCRIM data set. Mean rainfall could affect fishing effort, but also could affect water quality because of river runoff. Also, another similar factor was human population density, the variation of rainfall and habitat heterogeneity. So next. So I wanted to show you also data sets that we have long-term data, and I extracted PR crimp data, the sites that have that are the current sites that we are surveying, and some of these sites have more than 2 decades of data. And what I looked at was the changes in fish assemblages through time. So you can see that the circle to the left, Cabezas and Dominoes, those sites are actually located in San Juan. The circle in the middle, these sites are shallow sites, but these sites are the sites that have a high abundance of Acropora palmata and cervicornis. So they provide a different type of structure. And as you can see, fish assemblages. And then you have a big clump of sites to the right. So next. So again, I wanted to see what are the environmental factors driving the patterns that we see in this MDS. And again, using a distance-based multivariate multiple regression, you can see that the factors that play a more significant role in this pattern is depth, larval connectivity, distance from spawning grounds, max sea surface temperature, inorganic pollution, productivity, wave energy, change in benthic coverage, distance from marine protected area, and average degree heating week. So next. So with this, these are just some of the examples of what we're going to be getting through, and we're still analyzing a lot of these data sets. But we want to compare these quantitative models to that of the conceptual models. And just looking at the long-term PR crimp data and showing Tarsila's figure, the drivers that are I guess the components that are driving these relationships. You can see in the orange and red that there is some overlap. So disturbances, water temperature are highlighted as important components or important drivers to the fisheries ecosystem. Also water quality. And if you can see to the left in the quantitative model, you can see a lot of those variables are also very important in driving the fish assemblages. So there is some similarity. So moving forward, we're going to be doing more of this and seeing exactly what the similarities and what gaps there are and disparities. So next. So the highlights of this is that we're able, using a multi-specific, multivariate approach, we're able to describe the temporal trends and also spatial trends of the fisheries, fish assemblages and drivers, and also the benthic composition in different localities. And as I've been mentioning, and JJ and also Tarsila has mentioned, that the fisheries ecosystem is just not fishers and fish. There's also other important components, as Tarsila has shown, and I have briefly shown in the quantitative analysis, that they include physical, biological, and economic interactions. And through this unique approach, we hope that we can identify alternative drivers, specifically indicators and threats. So I will pass it on to JJ.
Thanks, Stacy. Just to wrap up a little bit of what we have done, we will go back to one of our first slides where we state what we wanted to achieve. And then in terms of those three tasks, we can say that we are in the process of finishing those conceptual models, one per island, since we're using an island-based fisheries management plan. I want to rescue from what Tarsila said, that was based on multiple stakeholders. We integrated diverse perceptions. We're building these conceptual models based on commonalities, and which we believe will strengthen the implementation of the final EFP. As per indicator, we are hoping that a final list will be provided to the EBFM tab later in May, and using both the quantitative and the qualitative approach that Tarsila and Stacy just summarized or explained before. And finally, we're gonna give an inventory of threats to the fishery system, which will be extracted from the conceptual models. I just want to finish this presentation saying that the construction of the fishery ecosystem plan is not only based on what we just show you today, but also in other work that is currently being done, like, for example, the risk assessment or the ecosystem status report. Finally, I just want to say that this obviously has been an effort of many other people, in addition to Tarsila, Stacy, and myself. And here are the people that we are just acknowledging for that. Finally, we would like to thank, obviously, the LENFES Ocean Program for the funding, but also the Council has played an important role in this, and the opinion of all the stakeholders that have had an input on our conceptual models. Now, I would like to thank you all for your participation in this webinar, and I would like to leave you with questions, if there are any questions. Happy to take them.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much to JJ, Tarsila, and Stacy for giving us some really great in-depth details on some of the progress that you're making in this project. I just want to say it's been really exciting to watch the progress you've all been making at LENFES. We think this is a really great demonstration of how you can bring together diverse viewpoints and different stakeholders and expand their representation throughout the management process. And this is really going to benefit both ecosystems and communities. So it's just really great to be to hear about all the great updates and progress. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for any live Q&A, and I actually don't have any Q&A in the Q&A panel. And I know that people need to probably have some meetings and need to move on in their day, but since we don't have time for live Q&A, if you do have questions or want to follow up on any of the information you saw today, the contact information for each of the speakers and research team members is located here on this slide. I'll also be copying them on the email that I send out with the recording link. Please reach out to them or us at LenFest. We're happy to have any follow-up conversations or coordinate any meetings after this webinar. So I just want to throw that out there for everyone. But also thank you again to JJ, Tarsila, and Stacy very much for the presentation. Very excited to see how it moves forward. All right, and with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks also for those who shared some resources and comments in the chat. We'll definitely be taking a look at those. And with that, we can go ahead and end. Everyone have a great day, and thanks again to our speakers.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.